Today's session is focusing on renewable energy and big tech. My name is Agnes Hatley. I'm Assistant Director of the Master of International Business program here at Fletcher. And it's my pleasure to welcome today's speakers, Amy Jaffe, Research Professor at Fletcher, also the Managing Director of Fletcher's Climate Policy Lab, and Adrian Anderson, who graduated the MIB program in 2010 and is currently working as Senior Director at Microsoft's Renewable Energy Group. Today's discussion is going to be moderated by Bhaskar Chakravorti, Dean of Global Business. As I mentioned, this event is being recorded, and we're very much hoping for this to be a conversation and welcome your questions throughout this 1 hour session. Please feel free to put up your blue hand, click the blue hand button on your screen if you would like to come on and ask your question in person, or use the chat function, and we are happy to share your question with the group out loud. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Dean Chakravorti.
Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to all of you. I'm assuming you are spread out in different parts of the world, and I also see a few people spread out in the waiting room, and I'm sorry we don't have any recent copies of People magazine for you. So anybody who's not been able to get in, Agnes, Dorothy, if you could just pull them in, and we'll give them a lot more entertaining than People magazine to chew on in this session. So this is another edition of Fletcher Futures, which is an opportunity to bring together different generations of perspectives on problems around the world in a way that is uniquely Fletcher. And when I say different generations, I mean a Fletcher graduate from the MIB program who is going off and has been doing some interesting work after leaving the building. And then a Fletcher expert who is in the building, who is doing some interesting work on the same set of issues while they're at Fletcher. And we put them in a room and they have a conversation about the work that they're doing. And we just listen up. And of course, it sparks questions in our minds. And we have this unique opportunity to ask those questions and pose those questions to a Fletcher graduate who is working in the area, and a Fletcher professor who is also working in the area from a research and teaching and advising perspective. So it's a really a wonderful opportunity to bring those different perspectives together. It's also an interesting opportunity to bring together perspectives from two major areas of concern and work and preoccupation for all of us. One is renewable energy, the green agenda, the climate change agenda, and the other is tech and the role that tech is playing in our lives. And this is a great place to see the convergence of the two. The tech industry, of course, has been under a microscope for a variety of reasons. Most notably with a lot of concerns about the power of tech in our day-to-day lives. And I'm sure you've been reading the headline stories about tech and the concerns that various government agencies have about the power of big tech. But at the same time, one way in which the power of big tech plays out is its climate impact. The major tech companies in the world, including Microsoft, represented here, or Google, or Facebook, or Amazon, Apple, they have made some pretty significant commitments in terms of carbon neutrality, going carbon negative by 2030 or 2040, make several other commitments in terms of how much they plan to reduce the use of natural resources, whether it is for cooling their data centers or for transforming resource utilization in the supply chain. So the tech industry, just given its power, can actually wield it in ways that are enormously positive in a number of directions, particularly in terms of reducing our collective carbon footprint. And so this is a great place to segue into the work that Adrian is doing. And let me kick this off by giving Adrian the floor and share with us the work that you've been doing, Adrian, at Microsoft. But we also know that, Adrian, your journey from Fletcher has taken you to Microsoft through a number of other places like Google and Amazon. So when we say big tech, you are Mr. Big Tech. And so you've done, played similar roles in several of the other companies that dominate this space. So we'd love to get a perspective on your work within Microsoft and how you see that in the larger context of your journey from Fletcher. And if there's anything that you can reflect on about the education that he had at Fletcher and the extent to which that has left an imprint on what you're doing today. It'd be wonderful to get that. And then I'll turn to Amy. In the meantime, let me just note that Adrian just looked behind him and pulled down the shades in his window. A rare event, dare I say, for somebody who is in Seattle, Washington, where apparently it rains 366 days a year. So I'm glad that we caught you on a sunny day, Adrian. But over to you.
Thank you very much. It's obviously a great pleasure to be here. It's been, and I say this a little bit cheekily, but it's been a decade since I've been at Fletcher, which when I was at Fletcher, I never thought I'd be in this position a decade later, talking about my time at Fletcher, which ironically, we went to a lot of these discussions with Fletcher alum. And so now it's really cool to be part of those discussions. So hello, everyone. I'm Adrian Anderson. I graduated from Fletcher as part of the inaugural MIB program, first class. I graduated back in 2010. And since then, I have been in the renewable energy space or in power generation of one way, shape, or form. Upon exiting Fletcher, I went to work for a company called UV. It's a German EPC firm, which means an engineering, procurement, and construction firm, building wind, solar, geothermal, and some biomass power plants. I was focused on the United States, some in Latin America, some in India, and a bunch of other regions. So doing the front end work, doing origination, finding new sites for wind or solar projects, contracting, getting what we call power purchase agreements in place for those deals, and then negotiating with counterparties. From there, in about 2015, I would say, I managed to negotiate a deal with Apple that fell apart, unfortunately. But fortunately, Apple called me up after the deal fell apart and hired me. So I worked for Apple for several years as a procurement manager, specifically focused on energy for data centers with a strategic focus on renewables. I then transitioned to Amazon from there on the not on the .com side, on the AWS side, so web services. I transitioned from Apple. We can go into all this, but I transitioned from Apple not because I didn't love the company, but I did not like the Bay Area. I loved to mountain bike and ski, and you could see the mountains. You could not get there with the traffic. It would take you hours. So that drove me nuts. So I worked for Amazon for a while. The culture and I did not fit. We were not, we just didn't mesh real well. Amazon says a lot of things externally and don't live up to them internally, in my opinion. I then went to work for Google, which I think is an amazing company to work for. I know it has a lot of issues. There's a lot of issues in the press right now for diversity and inclusion and some things like that. But fortunately, I worked for a group and a woman who was amazing. And I got a lot of great experience about that. Back in January of this year, I got an opportunity to go work for Microsoft. They actually recruited me as part of their January announcement to lead the renewable energy team and to lead part of the operational team to execute on our 2025 renewable energy goals and our 2030 carbon neutrality goals. And so far, it's been awesome. It's been a challenge. We have a long way to go, and it's been a lot of fun. Thinking about how I got here from Fletcher, and before we let everyone into the room to participate, I was chatting with Kristen and Dorothy and Amy and so forth, and we were talking about I wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for Fletcher. So the class I was in was amazing. The professors were awesome, and we got to explore a lot of different things that I never thought I'd get to explore. And ironically, one of the classes I liked but disliked the most was negotiations with Sal Hughes, and I learned how to negotiate and position and think about the soft skills that you need. I use that every day, whether it's getting something I need internally from a corporate stakeholder, whether it's an ancillary team. I deal with finance, treasury, accounting, tax, FX, all of these different groups internally, and I need them all to like me, or I need them to trust me. They don't have to like me. Most of them don't. I'll be honest. They have to trust me that I know what I'm doing and that I'm gonna take the best interests of the company and our customers into consideration. And then I use it externally every day. And I'm probably a lot more of a hard ass externally than I am internally, because my job is to go negotiate and get the best deals possible for the corporates that I work for. And so that requires sort of swinging your weight around a little bit and you know, taking stances that maybe others in the market can't take, but to try to open up the renewable space and the carbon space for others. Um, I think the thing I'm most proud of in the time since I left Fletcher was just the ability to develop and continue sort of using the skills that I learned at Fletcher. And one of the things that I hadn't got to do until recently was sort of the social impact side of things. Yeah, I'm building renewable energy, but we can have a discussion about sort of the complications and issues I see with that as the corporate's charge to sort of an arms race to who has the most renewables. Um, but I hadn't gotten to sort of dive into how to make a social impact beyond the corporate space. And so this year we announced a deal with a company called Soul Systems, and it's 500 megawatts of procurement. It's the largest single procurement Microsoft had done to date. And that partnership is really focused on environmental justice. So doing a lot of smaller projects combined with larger projects to bring the economics in a realm where we can handle them, but to also take a percentage of the revenues that we're paying Soul Systems and funnel that into community initiatives focused around energy access. And not where we tell them what to do. We basically are like, look, we're a big pocketbook. We're going to provide you the money. You tell us what your community needs. We have bookends that it needs to be related to energy access. But we're really focused on low and moderate income communities. We don't care if you're black, white, whatever color. It's focused on access and inclusion and transparency. So we're working in rural parts of the United States. We're working in urban parts of the United States. We're doing what was termed a peace rec in places like South Africa. We are charging down and trying to do things in the Netherlands with farmers and so forth. So it's been really great. It was the first company that I worked for that was like, yeah, go out and do this. We're really on board with transparency and inclusion, and we want to start with renewables. So I'll stop there. That's kind of about me. I also like to ride a mountain bike and ski and so forth.
And Adrian, we actually have a question for you in the chat, which I can share with the group. What, if any, projects have you worked on that address the carbon footprint of training AI models? Thank you.
Well, so I have a cheeky answer, and then we can dive into it. But my cheeky answer is I buy energy for data centers. So my job every day is to procure renewable energy. And so to take a step back, each of these tech companies said we're going 100% renewable, and Google is there, Apple is there, sort of. Amazon just had their big announcement that they are now the largest corporate procurement enterprise in the renewable space for tech companies. What that means for each of us is that for every megawatt hour of scope 2 emissions, so for every electron we consume, we will purchase 1 electron of renewable energy on an annual basis to offset. So if I used 100 units in a year, I will buy 100 units of renewables. We're all sort of traveling to that space really quickly. Now, obviously, the electrons don't necessarily travel to our data centers. But my cheeky answer is I procure renewables. So every day, my job is to secure renewable energy for the data centers, and AI and ML is processed through our data centers. So all the time is my answer. The more in-depth answer is a lot of the AI and ML activities that I work on are related to optimization for renewable power generation, They're related to trying to optimize transmission and grid access, for creating a smarter grid so that utilities and others can more actively participate in a liquid market that ensures that there isn't crazy price volatility and that allows for reliability and low carbon supply. Um, the issue that we're facing now is that, as myself at Microsoft and friends of mine at Google and Facebook and Apple and all these other companies drive towards 100% renewable, we're putting a lot of unit contingent resources on the grid. And that means that power prices spike all over the place all the time, because you can't control when wind blows and you can't control when the sun shines. What that means is that we're creating a lot more volatility in the markets, and really utilities are there to try to help dissipate that volatility, but without real-time signals from machine learning and AI, we won't be able to address everything. We can put storage on the grid, we can do all sorts of things, but quite frankly, those opportunities are fairly limited unless you get a lot smarter with your grid analytics. So I don't know if I answered your question 100% on the non-cheeky side, but that's my answer.
Great. I think both the cheeky and the non-cheeky is extremely enlightening. I think Agnes has another question that she'd like to put to you, and this is from Utsav Mulai. And then I'd like to turn to Professor Amy Jaffe to get some perspectives from her. So Agnes, go ahead.
Sure. Utsav is wondering about your thoughts on Amazon's carbon footprint. What part of their business is the biggest contributor? Their data centers or the entire logistics infrastructure? They are yet to publish their sustainability report.
That is a hard question. So data centers are a huge scope 2 emitter, right? Like, we consume a ton of electricity. And when we talk about data centers, and I apologize if I'm going off and saying terms and things like that that are unfamiliar with folks, please put your hand up or ping me, let me know and I can stop and explain them. But data centers use anywhere from a few megawatts to hundreds of megawatts per data center location. So if you can think about it like, we all are this, we consume as much energy as, let's say, PG&E or others in some circumstances globally. So for Amazon, I would say that if you think about it and you step back and look at carbon holistically, their scope 3 emissions are probably really, really high. I don't think that's all of it, but like all of the third-party sellers, you have to take all the transportation that they have. That becomes a scope 3 emission because you're one stage removed. So I think their scope 3 emissions are probably significantly high. I don't think they've ever looked at that. Maybe they have now. I know that they are really making a push in the last few years to get more sustainable. Based on my experience there, data centers and transportation were their largest, especially because they own airplanes now and a whole fleet of airplanes. So I would say that the transportation and the data centers are sort of neck and neck in terms of emissions. And then you sort of start traveling down the scope 3 path and addressing those emissions. And those are probably pretty significant. For Microsoft, my scope 3 emissions for Xbox and Surface tablets. So every time you turn on your, actually, it's not the times when you turn on your Xbox, it's the times that your Xbox is off, where it's running updates, that they consume the most electricity. For our scope 3 emissions, those are about equivalent to my scope 2 emissions. So that's a lot. Like, I'm in the process of procuring 6 to 8 gigawatts of energy to meet our 2025 100% goal. And that's renewable. So you have to think it's a 30% capacity factor, and you'd back into the math that way. But our scope 3 emissions are just as large and growing every day.
Okay, so why don't we'll come back to you, Adrian. I'm sure there is a whole surge of questions that are already on their way, but let me give Amy a chance to weigh in with her work. And Amy, we're particularly struck by the fact that you have a book coming out, among other things that you are working on at Fletcher, and your book is called Energy's Digital Future. So very nicely ties into the work that Adrian is doing, which is digital's energy future. So we'd love to learn more about the book and the work that the Climate Policy Lab is doing.
Well, let me be again cheeky and say that changing the order of those words, which Bhaskar, I appreciate your cleverness in pointing that out, really does make a difference. And that is because Adrian is doing an amazing job making sure that his company is reducing its carbon footprint as it moves through its business and society. And the questions that are coming in through the chat are the right questions. But part of the thing that we do at Climate Policy Lab, and I do in my own research, is to analyze whether Adrian's company or other companies, or even the automobile industry and the oil industry, are the corporate sector going to get there, quote unquote, to the right answer? Will there be unintended consequences to their pursuit of the right answer? And how would people in the policy community ensure that what is the right answer for a corporation does not become the wrong answer for a low income person or for emissions in general? So I look at all the technologies coming out and I think about the following kinds of questions. If Amazon is going to use drones, is that better for the environment or worse for the environment? If Amazon distribution centers, if they have more distribution centers closer to the end user, is that better or worse for the environment? And that takes a lot of study, believe it or not, to figure out what are the logistics, how are trucks traveling, what are the fuels of the future that these trucks are going to use? Does automation matter? If we apply AI to program, I don't think many of you probably do not realize today, but the reason Amazon can tell you what time your package is coming, or UPS, is that they use big data, and drivers no longer decide, I'm turning to the left, I'm turning to the right. The packages are put in the truck or the plane based on an algorithm. That algorithm tells the deliverer which packages to order to deliver first, second, and third to eliminate fuel use. And so there's a whole science to it. And one of the things we do now at Fletcher, which we probably did a bit of when Adrian was there, but we're really expanding our focus now, is to look at the critical questions that go with that. When you look at new tech coming out, either in my sphere, which is energy and climate, or in the cyber program, or an IT and communications program, we need to look at these sort of unintended consequences and think about, how do we protect privacy? How do we protect democracy? How do we lower carbon emissions and make sure that these technologies are being used in a way that they lower the environmental footprint? And let me just say my pitch, having heard Adrian talk about his work. I think one of the great things about getting an advanced degree, for those of you who've already done it, but for those who might be on the call today who are thinking about it, is that there are analysis skills, whether those are data analysis skills or sort of like, I call the modeling skill, which is how do I put into a framework those things I have to think through to make a successful strategy. Those are the kind of skills that you learn at the Fletcher School. And so to give you an idea, somebody asked the question about logistics. I've already talked to people who are probably going to wind up being in the Biden administration about what their truck policy is going to be and what they need to be doing in trucks. I was involved in California for 5 years, helping the state develop its policy towards making trucks more sustainable. There's a social justice issue that's related here because you have a lot of fence line communities near ports and distribution centers that take the burden of the pollution from diesel trucks that idle waiting for their packages. So A lot of important tasks come on what seemed to be a very boring topic, which is trucks. But there's a lot actually of important work that one can do working in trucks. And Adrian mentioned, and then I'll turn it back, this thing about volatility and electricity pricing. Well, there are fairness issues there too, which if you're a regulator, in either a state regulator or a federal regulator, you need to consider in terms of who gets the financial benefit of low cost renewable energy. Does it go to corporations and do they pass that on to us? What about the high cost of transmission, or who benefits from storage? And how do we distribute that to the average American in their electricity bill? Because that has not been fully resolved, I think, in a way that it needs to be. So a lot of interesting issues in this space.
So let me just pick up this question that at the tail end of what Amy just observed, which is who pays the price for reducing carbon emissions? Does it get pushed upstream or does it come down to customers? Does Microsoft or do any of the other companies have a position on that, Adrian?
You're asking a very loaded question. There are so many strings and fun things we could have a discussion about that Amy raised and that you're raising. I could talk for hours about all this stuff. So I'm an energy wonk and a nerd in that respect and still love it as much as I did when I was at Fletcher. Yeah, we're trying to address that. So like the ancillary issues that we create are up to this point, I think, issues that a lot of us corporates hadn't thought about. It's great to charge after 100% renewable energy, sort of. We create a lot of market volatility. We will, each one of us tech companies, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Google, Microsoft, will all be procuring more generation than the majority of the utilities in the United States at this point. And what does that do? It creates a lot of market volatility. It creates a lot of inequality. Are you taking the tax benefits and the other benefits, the air quality benefits and other things, and are you sort of pushing those down outside of the corporate space and into more community-based thought process? I can speak from Microsoft's perspective. The cost of the carbon that we've put into the environment by 2050, we're taking all of that, we're taking our historical emissions out of the environment, right? We're going to pay for that. It's offsets, it's carbon sequestration projects, it's other carbon types projects, it's renewable energy. It's, I think I saw in the chat about asking about efficiency at the data centers and AI and ML. It's about getting significantly more efficient. The irony, I've been in the tech space now for, I guess, what are we, 21? So yeah, six some years. 6 months is a long time in the tech space. Like the amount of efficiency gains we're seeing in data centers is crazy. Like when I first started, we were told data centers are not able to shed load or increase load based on demand response signals. Like we just can't do it. There's no way, it'll never happen. Well, now folks like Google and us and others are shifting non-essential loads to help reduce carbon. We're looking at carbon emissions to reduce those loads. We're shifting between other data centers. There are so many things that are happening that are interesting in the space. I think the next 5 years is going to be really amazing on the technology and the AI and ML front. I know that gets said on a regular basis. We're always in that constant like, oh, it's going to even be cooler in the next 5 years. I think we're in the energy space and the data center space, we're just starting to hit our stride. And I think we should be responsible for the cost of carbon and removal. And I honestly, it goes back to Amy's point of like, who gets the benefits of low cost renewables? Well, unfortunately, renewables are not like a cost benefit analysis in most cases. Unless you're in a regulated service territory and you're paying a really high electricity rate, renewables cost money. You're not doing this for an arbitrage. You're basically, without going into too much detail, you're not buying a baseload project. So if you're taking in resource availability, negative covariance, and a bunch of other things, you're actually always taking a discount to the power price. So you're always paying money to remove traditional generation. Eventually, when the next incremental megawatt on the system is a zero cost fuel resource, then ancillary charges, capacity charges, and things like that will start making up for those costs. But right now, we're trying to do initiatives like with Soul Systems where we're trying to bring some of those benefits to other. I have no idea if it's going to work, and I understand that coming from a privileged white dude at a tech company, there's a significant amount of irony dripping off of my statements about equality. I have been very lucky and fortunate to get where I am, but I think people like Salesforce and other companies like us are really trying to drive that message home that it's not. It's the Fletcher message. The whole premise of the MIB program, at least when I was there, was there's something beyond revenues. There's something beyond driving that bottom line in your margin, and that's your impact beyond selling products. It's how do you make the world a better place? And I know we make a lot of mistakes doing it, and there's a lot of issues with working with a giant tech company. But I think a lot of that is being taken into heart with a lot of these companies, and they're pushing initiatives to try to think 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years out.
And let me add to that, that having Fletcher students like myself and Bhaskar and others who I'm going to mention in a minute because there was a question in the chat, is how we hope to inform corporations on how to align their profit motive and their products with sustainability. Because the first step is to have people like Adrian, who have a master's from Fletcher and understand all the issues related to sustainability, be in the room when the strategies are being worked out. And when not every meeting he goes to, he probably can weigh in and say, no, that's a bad idea. It's going to affect people the following way.
I probably do.
But he can behind the scenes, and then in a meeting where it's appropriate, try to steer people towards the solutions that he knows is going to produce the best social outcome. So, and we have a lot of Fletcher faculty that work on that. I noticed that one of them has joined us today. I don't know if she can pipe in, but Barbie Gates-Garrick Garnick teaches several courses on electricity and public policy, and is an experienced regulator in the electricity sector in the state of Massachusetts. Kelly Sims Gallagher, who works with me at Climate Policy Lab, is a leading expert not only on climate change policy, on energy and science innovation, but she works and we work with governments to try to help governments learn how to implement. I saw somebody ask the question in the chat about carbon sequestration and storage and how do governments incentivize that. That's what we do at Climate Policy Lab. You know, you're a government, whether you're China, India, some other government, and you want to figure out what are the best practices for promoting CCS or reducing emissions. That's what we do. We help you figure out in your context, in your culture, in your rulemaking, how can you do it in your government so that you meet these goals that are set through the Paris Agreement or hopefully future agreements that are more ambitious. And then I mentioned we're now working together with Gib Metcalf, who's in the Tufts Economics Department. We have some students that are Fletcher students, but also are getting joint degrees in economics. And Gib is one of the most foremost experts in the United States on tax credits and tax policy. And he's spent a lot of his time thinking about social equity issues when it comes to tax policy. So we're absolutely going to launch a new research strain that focuses directly on that, because that's material. You've got the Biden administration coming in, a lot of talk about green stimulus, not only in the United States, but in other parts of the world. And how do you do that in a COVID-related environment where you're both creating jobs and bring a livelihood to people, but in a way that's climate friendly? And the tech companies, you know, we like to pick on the tech companies, but the tech companies have the minds and the technology to be enabling. And, that's where our role comes in at Fletcher, which is, how do we train people like Adrian to think that through? How do we put some people who start out like Adrian in the commercial sector and then go into policy, make a big contribution because they bring that knowledge of how the corporate sector operates to the question of how do I regulate a policy that would be the least costly for consumers, but provide the biggest social benefit for the buck. And that's why you're coming to Fletcher, right? Is to really be in that sweet spot where you're not killing jobs, but you're also doing what's best.
So, Amy, I have a question that draws upon some of the questions in the chat, and I'm going to merge some of these, and it's under the broad label of sustainable development. We've been talking about the sustainability side of the equation, and I guess the question is on the development side. So one part of this question has to do with who on the Fletcher faculty is working on renewable energy business development agenda or regulatory policy for low-income communities. And associated with that, a similar question looking at the issue at a global level, and specifically what do we do at Fletcher in the context of developing countries that have a pretty significant coal and gas component to their energy mix, and how do we think about the balance that the developing countries have to face? So essentially thinking about all these issues, but in the context of different segments of a single country's population or countries across the world, at different stages of socioeconomic development, and how are we formulating ideas and policies and creative solutions that bring these elements together?
Well, we have many faculty that work on that from different perspectives, including yourself, Bhaskar. But I mean, Jenny Akers' work on sustainable development, of course, has been groundbreaking in many countries, especially in Africa. And she and others collaborating with the Kleinman School. Am I getting that right? I was for health, and are working on projects, active projects that students are working on that are going to bring those kind of solutions to India and combine both carbon sustainability and food security. So there's just a lot of people working in that space, and there's a lot of interest. I mean, I think the other thing that at Fletcher, it's not just who's going to teach this class or whose research is on a particular topic, because a lot of things are student initiative. So students can come, you have your capstone project, and maybe you are interested in a particular country, in a particular question about what they're going to do about coal. Or let's say you have a concern about low-income communities in the United States and how we're going to bring lower electricity costs. That's something that students can initiate with a faculty member as their capstone project. I have a few students have come to me with very interesting capstones about the future of the oil and gas industry and how to pivot communities to different kinds of employment, and what's worked and what hasn't. And I think all these topics, I mean, Bobby, can you weigh in? Can we unmute you and you can talk a little bit about some of the projects you've done with students? I see you in the list.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm happy to. I mean, again, as you pointed out, there are all of the global opportunities, but some of these issues are also very local. And, you can't do any development today without bringing in the issue of equity. And I'm seeing that in a lot of the offshore wind projects that are happening. And when you work, for example, with organizations like the T, and you start to say, How do you equalize cost among all ratepayers or all customers? These are issues I think that we're continuing to look at in a lot more detail. And I can tell you now, and I know Amy will back me up on this, that these companies now are finally beginning to understand that these issues can't be second issues, but need to be critical in their early conversations. And I think that this is now the change. And the other thing to know is that renewable energy is not pristine. We always think as renewable energy as being just a very positive force, but where you locate your solar facility, where you connect your wind into the grid, all of these become issues of social equity. And when you go to talk to companies, and I will tell you an example. For example, you have to not only walk the walk, not only talk the talk, but walk the walk. I would just, this is one thing, is that I went to talk to a major, with a company, to talk to GE, and GE in Massachusetts is headed by Mo Cowan, who is a former US Senator. And for us to come in and say that we care about the community and come in lily white, men, one woman, me, it rings hollow. So I can tell you that these realities are finally beginning to hit these companies, and that you can't place decision makers in LLCs. They have to be true decision makers. So those are just some of the ways that you begin to see these issues play out.
Great.
Adrian, can you talk to us a little bit about what happens when you're trying to work in an international setting, and what kind of skills need to be brought to bear?
Certainly. I was going to say, I agree with Barbara. I'm not sure I fully understood the last part of the LLC comment. But I fully agree. I think you got to walk the walk and the talk, because we're all very good at talking about it. And then you start breaking it apart and you're like, I don't know if that's actually doing what you're saying it's doing. And I would totally agree on the renewable side of things. Any infrastructure project, you've got to pay attention to the social aspect of it and how you're reflecting. And I think one thing I would say is the awesome thing about Tufts and Fletcher is that you can take classes at MIT and at Harvard and others. I don't know if you still can do that, but you could shadow. So I don't want to get Dorothy in trouble, but go take system dynamics at MIT. I use it every day in my work. It literally helps with all the things we're talking about, because you start to see how your actions impact the actions of others, and then have all these unintended consequences. To answer your question, Amy, what's cool about my job is I work in every geography. We have 60 different regions right now of data center locations. I work in APAC, I work in EMEA, I work in Latin America, I work everywhere. So my days start at like 5 a.m. and they end at 9 p.m. at night, which kind of sucks, but I get to work in multiple time zones with multiple different counterparties, with pushing governments in the Middle East to give me a regulated tariff for renewable energy and to do something socially impactful on the back end. What is cool about my job is that it goes back to an old Fletcher saying, is like, the local is global for me, and global is local, because every market that I enter into globally, we impact a local community of some way, shape, or form. And we need to have boots on the ground. We need to have a good understanding of what the community needs, what they want, and how we're impacting them long term. Data centers these days are huge energy hogs. Now, not really a big deal if you know about the energy infrastructure and you've got a much more holistic picture of how energy systems work. There's always going to be enough energy to produce and figure out a way to be consumed by these companies. The issue is that up until, I would say, the last 3 or 4 years, data center companies went in and just built infrastructure projects like every other infrastructure. They didn't really consult with anyone. They didn't think about the impacts. They didn't think about public sentiment, or are you taking land away from farmers, or are you building renewable energy where you should be giving some of that renewable energy to the local community and they're not getting any benefits? I think companies now are starting to think a lot farther ahead. And like when we plan a data center, we do a lot of initial outreach. We start figuring out what kind of programs we can implement to help, whether it's workforce training, whether it's renewables for the local community, whether it's water reclamation, or simple things like painting the data center a different freaking color than gray. Like there's all sorts of little and big things to do. Um, I think my time at Fletcher actually really prepared me well, because I can go into a lot of these discussions where the folks that I work with who just have business backgrounds, they don't think about the soft skills of how you're engaging with the community and how you need to engage with each part or each counterparty with some research. You need to spend a little bit of time and try to figure out what they want and dig behind what they're saying into what they really want to get out of this transaction, or what they want to get out of the conversation, or and so I think taking a humanistic element on a lot of this is really helpful. Obviously, I work for a giant company, and Amy, to your point, you should keep harassing tech companies, keep giving them a hard time. It's driving us to do a lot better. We have a shit ton of cash, pardon my French, sorry. We have a lot of cash. We should deploy it to do better things, to do good things, to push everyone forward, not just us. So keep harassing us. I think it's doing a lot of good. I mean, look, we're engaged with the, can I say that? I don't know what I can say. We're engaged with administrations and helping energy policy. And I think one of the benefits we bring to the table is we're not policymakers, right? We influence policy. I help influence policy. I spent a ton of time in Taiwan opening up access for renewables there for corporates. I've spent a ton of time in Singapore doing the same thing, multiple other markets internationally. What we bring to the table is a good commercial mindset where policymakers may think, here's what the implications are and here's how we address it. We can actually look to empirical fact and know how electricity markets work, know how our tax capital is deployed and not deployed, and all the different tricks that we can use to get away with things. We can bring that understanding to these discussions and help create real solid implementation solutions, where I think in many cases, I've seen a lot of policies that have significantly unintended consequences that you could have. It's the same thing like you were saying, we need policy folks on the business side and we need business folks on the policy side, because those two realms by themselves just make tons of mistakes. And so I think there's a really wonderful intersection that's starting to happen, and hopefully it continues.
And that comes to, doing your homework.
Yeah.
Right. So, in the international policy class, there's an entire unit on energy conversion, because, people think they're going to just figure that out in a minute. And actually, it's really important in electricity. If you can't do it properly, you're going to be in a really bad place.
Yep.
Right. So, but my new theme, I was actually going to bring a slide today, and then I thought, no, that's too formal. Right. Is looking at the difference between carbon neutrality and net zero. Because in carbon neutrality, not Adrian, but somebody else could just go out and buy carbon offsets and pollute the hell out of it, and they've checked the box.
Yeah, I was going to say,
right?
to be clear, all corporations are guilty of that.
Okay, but in net zero, which is where the community is trying to push corporations to, in net zero, it's not about offsetting. I'm planting some trees over here to offset the paper that I'm wasting over here. It's really about abating those sectors that I can in my business, as Adrian's doing by switching to renewables. And then on top of that, figuring out how I'm going to come up with negative emissions that are going to truly offset. I'm actually going to take emissions out of the air through biofuels with sequestration, or through direct air capture, or through some kind of sequestration technology. I'm going to actually take emissions out of the system and use that as a true offset. And that, that's a lot harder to do. That's going to take a lot more technology knowledge and policy knowledge. And I think Adrian really makes the point. Let's say you're thinking of going into finance. This is a really important area of finance. And one of the most interesting things I've gotten to do in my career, which was totally accidental, is that at the University of California, as many of you can think about, they're big conflict about what to divest from and not to divest from in terms of investments. And they need to have a process and a way of evaluation. And I taught that class at the business school at Davis. And so they literally took me out of my classroom and put me at the pension fund for 3 years. And it was my job to meet with corporations to talk to them about whether we would no longer buy their stock if they didn't do A, B, and C that we thought was necessary to eliminate the risk to their business from climate change and other things. So, very impactful in the sector, continues to be impactful in the sector. If you're thinking you want to have a job in finance or in the regulation of finance markets, again, these are all issues that require sophisticated study in a master's degree program or even in a PhD. So a lot of different things to do.
Even supplier, like we updated our code of conduct this year in January to basically all of our suppliers have to disclose diversity, transparency, carbon emissions, reduce carbon emissions. There's a whole slate of things that Microsoft decided, you know what, if you're going to procure, if we're going to buy something from you, you need to meet our standards. So all of those companies that are downstream from Microsoft, all those companies that are downstream from Apple, from Caterpillar, from all of these companies that are making these really flashy claims in the public. They're great press headlines. I hope we all get there. But all of us who are making these claims and all the ancillary companies that supply us, they all need folks like you who know how to do this, because none of us know how to do it. Like, we may all talk a good game, but quite frankly, we we need to get a lot smarter about how to do all of this. And we have to do it now. Right?
And let me add to that. The companies are going to have to do it now. And that is because the Biden administration is not going to let companies off the hook anymore when it comes to disclosure. Right?
No,
There are going to be all kinds of new rules at the SEC, even the Fed, that are going to be rowing in that direction to require true disclosure and not just boilerplate that some lawyer developed. And I think that in answer to the question in the chat, I believe that's going to make a big difference for my work at the UC.
I would say there are always ways around SEC disclosures, as we all can have seen throughout history. So I applaud what Biden's administration is going to be doing. I was thinking more just generally, we don't have much time to implement it. Like, we need to get moving. Like, all of these things need to be implemented. We're all talking about them and talking about them and talking about them and piloting things. But in the decade that since I've left Fletcher, there hasn't been a lot of new technology other than storage. But quite frankly, the storage technology when I left Fletcher is exactly the same as it's now. It's just slightly less costly. And there's just it is out in the market more, but not enough. So I think we just have to move. I think governments can mandate it. I think it comes down to us as shareholders and consumers from these companies to be like, we want you to do it. The only reason that Amazon is pushing hard back into renewables and sustainability is because they started to see customer attrition and customers coming to them and saying, you know what, we're not going to cite our load on your data center because Apple is greener or Microsoft is greener. So we're going to move our business. And they were like, oh God, wait, hold on. And so then they were starting to get hit with the antitrust, and they don't want to be in Facebook's position. So regulation does play a part. I think it's more ancillary to directing to customer sentiment.
So speaking of getting a move on, we are just about to hit that moment where we feel we've just started a Fletcher conversation. This is such a Fletcher conversation, right? We talk about things that are at the intersection that virtually nobody else talks about, because you're talking about business, you're talking about a policy, you're talking about technology, you're talking about regulation. So all of these issues come together, and before you know it, an hour has gone by. I know that several of you have to now jump off. I do want to respect the time that everybody has shared with us here. But if somebody has a really quick question, I'm going to auction this time off for one blue hand to come up. So I'm just waiting for one blue hand, and you can ask the question live on air to either Adrian or Amy or both. So who's going to go first? Anyone in the audience? Going once, going twice. if you put a question in the chat, you can call that out as well.
Reid
All right.
raised his hand.
Reid.
All right, guys.
Reid Gustafson.
Yeah, close. Gustafson. So I asked the question in the chat. So I work for Philips Healthcare. We're large capital equipment, big iron. And the thing we talk about is old equipment. I got a 10-year-old X-ray. Am I carbon neutral if I just dump it in a landfill? Microsoft makes the Surface. I mean, you guys have hardware too, lithium batteries. How do you guys deal with that? More than just, balancing out a data center, but you're balancing out all these resources.
Yeah. So candidly, we're figuring it out. Those are the waste is one of the biggest issues for us. It's not just waste that we have already. It's the waste, we're doing all these wind projects. We're doing all these solar projects. We want to think about micronuclear and all the concrete, all of the stuff we use in our data centers. We're working on it. Apple had an amazing recycling program for their batteries and for their phones. It's changing a little bit because of our relationship with China and with other countries about how we recycle and how we report out what actually recycling is. I don't have a good answer for you. I'd like to say melt it down and reuse it, but I honestly don't know. We're working through the same thing. So if you figure out a good way to do it, please, let's keep chatting about it. We're plunking down billions of dollars at a time on these data centers, and they're just hunks of steel and precious metals and concrete. And then we're doing the same thing with renewables, right? Eventually there's not enough materials for batteries or solar panels and things like that. And so how are we thinking about recycling them? I know First Solar is doing a really good job of taking, now granted they're young and solar panels have a life of 40 years or so on, but they're trying to start recycling that stuff, and they have a very active process where they take the cells and they repurpose them again and try to get their efficiency back up. But yeah, I don't mean to cop out, but I don't have a good answer for you. I wish I did. I'd probably be really rich if I did.
No, I think, First Solar is a good example, and recycling and clean tech is going to be a big part of it. All that lithium needs to be recovered and recycled and reused. There is a emerging technology, there was an emerging field, which is called waste to energy. A lot of it is taking methane from landfills and thinking about how to use it to generate electricity or other things in a way that is better carbon neutrality. But there are some technologies out there to literally take waste and turn it into hydrogen, and then use the hydrogen as a fuel, a cleaner fuel for heavy industry in general, for fabricating steel and so forth. So there are some things happening at the cutting edge. You might Google a company called Sierra Energy, which is a California company that has a waste to energy solution that DOE has funded. But there are probably some others more in Europe, and that's going to be a big field.
The issue with a lot of those is they're obscenely expensive to do, and they use a ton of energy. So they all kind of cascade, and we just have to use less is basically the moral of the story.
Yeah, so we have to use less, and we have so many more questions for both Amy and Adrian. If it's okay for people to reach out to you, either on email or on LinkedIn, we'll, hopefully it's okay for them to reach out and at least connect, and if they have questions, they can follow up. This has been an amazing opportunity to just be a fly on the wall and maybe, occasionally pop in and buzz over your heads and get some reactions. There is just so much to learn about this space. So thank you for sharing your insights from out there in the wild world called the real world, and in here in this equally wild world called the Fletcher School. So thank you, Amy. Thank you, Adrian, for enlightening us. This concludes this edition of Fletcher Futures. If you want to see the conversations that we had before, our last conversation was about business and religion. Just imagine business and religion. And we just pivoted from that to business and tech and energy and a renewable future. We'll know, I think our next one, which is going to be early in 2021, is going to be on the topic of social impact. I think that's where we're headed. So do stay tuned and do stay connected with us. Thank you for joining us And we look forward to seeing you in person soon, and hopefully virtually before that. Have a wonderful turn into the new year, and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fletcher team. Thank you, Amy.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.